Hi everyone. Today we are here for our Thursday lecture, and as you are well aware that we also give an opportunity to our own researchers, basically with two purposes in mind. One is that once you speak in a public domain like this, along with the hybrid mode, you gain confidence and expertise, and you also build up a name for yourself in due course of time, being visible in all mass media. So today we are fortunate that this opportunity is free, who has joined us in very time frame, but he has done a lot and very forthcoming girl. And the subject what she had chosen, I'm sure she will have an emotional connect also with that. So besides intellectual inputs, we will be able to see some kind of different perspectives. So the terrorism in Kashmir per se is, apparently known to most of us, but not in adequate analytical format as it should be, especially when we can recommendations which are more pragmatic rather than just pose and things like that. So before she starts, Vinayak can introduce her.
Good morning, everyone. Ms Vaibhavi Katal is a research assistant and the publication manager at CENJOWS. Prior to this, she has worked at Center for International Security and Economic Strategy as a policy analyst, in Pankaj Kumar Jha Center for Security Studies as a senior research analyst, and in Center for Middle East as a research head. She has earned a honors in global affairs and a minor in business and finance and a master's degree in terrorism, security, and society from King's College London. She has over 15 publications in her name, largely focusing on India's national security, foreign policy, bilateral ties, and cross border terrorism that were published by prominent think tanks and defense magazines like Defense and Security Alert. In future, she wishes to continue her pursuit of understanding India's security infrastructure and the role of Indian foreign policy in the same.
Thank you, sir, for giving me this opportunity, and thank you, Vinayak, for introducing me. So my today's topic is terrorism in Kashmir, genesis and causes. But before we dive into the genesis and causes of the same, it is very imperative to first, could you go to the next page, please? It is very imperative to first conceptualize the term terrorism. So what is terrorism? Is it just a politically motivated act of violence to instill fear, or does the characteristics agreed upon definition in the world of academia? And why is that so? Because scholars disagree whether the actions of a state counts or not, whether civilians must be targeted or not, and does religion and ideology have any role to play in it or not. Bruce Hoffman, who's an American expert in the field of terrorism, noted that most people have vague idea about terrorism and the impression of what it is, but lack a precise, concrete, and truly explanatory definition of the same. So one could say that the US waged an entire war on terror without having a set definition, and that the Middle East has been grappling with global terrorism without a definition. Clearly, we have a definition problem at hand. Although we don't have a definition, but we do have countermeasures in place. We still have waged a war. So then why do we need a definition? A working definition is important because it shapes laws, security policies, and international cooperation. It determines who is to be prosecuted as a terrorist and who is to be prosecuted as just a criminal, and how states respond, and how data is to be collected for research. It's harder to coordinate globally. Terrorism and ordinary crime look similar because both involve violence, fear, and illegal acts. The key difference lies in the motive. Criminals usually act for personal gain, while terrorists have religious or ideological agendas. But in practice, groups may fund terrorism through crime, which blurs the line between the two. Anthony Quinton, the former director of the Office for Combating Terrorism at the United States State Department, said that this problem of definition has bedeviled the development of an effective counter-terrorist strategy at both national and international level. So we are grappling with the definition problem because it is very important to know what we are fighting against. For example, war against drugs. When you understand, when you clearly outline what you're fighting against, it gets easier to know what your target is, what are their characteristics. Now, when we talk about terrorism, there are certain terms that are often misconstrued and used interchangeably, although they are wrong. So terrorism is different from insurgency, and insurgency is different from militancy. All three are different and should not and must not be used interchangeably. So what is terrorism? The motive is to create fear to influence political decisions, whereas in insurgency, the aim is to overthrow or challenge the state authority. In militancy, it's an aggressive activism for a cause. In terrorism, the targets are often people or symbolic places, but in insurgency, the targets are state forces, institutions, and sometimes territory. In militancy, the targets are state or the rival groups. In terrorism, the scale and structure varies from small to large, and there are covert cells, and the strategy is based more on instilling fear. In insurgency, the scale and structure is more organized and long-term armed movement. And militancy is a bigger umbrella term under which insurgency falls. So they're largely the same, but have few different characteristics. The scale and structure for militancy can be loosely organized, and they're not always large scale. And in India's context, the examples for terrorism is Lashkar-e-Taiba, their 2008 Mumbai attacks. Unfortunately, insurgency. So terrorism is what we see in Jammu and Kashmir. Insurgency is what we largely see in Northeast. So the examples are the National Liberation Front of Tripura, People's Liberation Army of Manipur, and there are many more in Northeast. In militancy are basically the aggressive activism of groups who want to rebel against the state or the rival groups. So the initial stages of JKLF can also be called a militant group that was later turned into a terrorist organization when they had more funding and they become more trained. Now diving into the genesis of terrorism in Kashmir. To answer this, one must go back in history to one of the most seismic events of 1947, that is the partition of British India, and the creation of two sovereign states, that is of India and Pakistan. One of the most consequential and enduring legacies of the partition was the unresolved status of the then state of Jammu and Kashmir. Jammu and Kashmir was a geopolitical paradox. The ruler of the state was a Hindu ruler, Maharaja Hari Singh, whereas the population was predominantly Sunni Muslim in the Kashmir Valley, Hindus in the Jammu region, and Buddhists in Ladakh. During partition, rules of access princely states, the decision to whether join India or Pakistan rested with the ruler. Maharaja Hari Singh was more inclined towards staying independent. However, Pakistani tribal invasion from Waziristan, backed by Pakistan Army, started in October 1947 that quickly overwhelmed the J&K state forces of the Maharaja. The Kabalis plundered the Baramulla town and were well within the striking distance of the sole airport of Srinagar. Upon witnessing this violation of the standstill agreement by Pakistani tribal militias, Maharaja Hari Singh sought India's help to stop and oust the Kabalis. That's when India intervened only after Maharaja signed the instrument of accession, legalizing the accession of Jammu and Kashmir to India. This was the beginning of the first Indo-Pak War in 1947-48 to wrest control over Jammu and Kashmir. Followed by this, all thanks to Nehru, his grave error of judgment, he took the matters to UN in January 1948 under Article 35 of the UN Charter, accusing Pakistan of aggression. The UN set up the United Nations Commission for India and Pakistan in April 1948 and proposed four things: a ceasefire, withdrawal of Pakistani forces and tribesmen, reduction of Indian forces, and plebiscite to determine the future of Jammu and Kashmir. This did little to resolve the core issue. Although the ceasefire froze the conflict, Pakistani forces refused to withdraw, and hence the plebiscite never took place. Pakistan retained control of the significant territory of the state, which it now terms as Azad Jammu and Kashmir. Following that, there were political developments in the region. Article 370 was introduced in January 26, 1950 to provide special autonomous status to Jammu and Kashmir, allowing the state to have its own constitution, flag, and autonomy over internal matters. Later, Article 35A was introduced on 14 May 1954 through a presidential order, empowering Jammu and Kashmir's legislator to define who were to be called the permanent residents and who were not to be, aimed at preserving the demographic and cultural identity. This insulated the Jammu and Kashmir from the rest of the country, stopping interaction and investment in the state for the rest of the country. Later, there was also demographic deficit. In 1987, the J&K assembly elections were widely perceived to be rigged and unfair. The opposition alliance, Muslim United Front, was believed to have been systematically defeated through manipulation. Many young politically mobilized Kashmiris felt that their democratic aspirations were crushed. Democracy came to be viewed as ineffective and imposed rather than representative. The elections marked a turning point, creating a deep loss of faith in democratic processes. In 1987, the elections strengthened the narrative that the armed struggle was the only viable option for political change. Following the widespread discontent among the Kashmiri populace, Pakistan started a systematic campaign of funneling weapons, providing extensive training, and disbursing funds to Kashmiri youths. This external backing provided the so-called militant groups the organizational capacity, resources, and strategic direction that enabled an emerging separatist sentiment to evolve into an armed terrorist group. Among the earliest and the most prominent of these groups was the Jammu and Kashmir Liberation Front. So all these reasons kept adding to making the region more vulnerable to the external influence. Then came the Afghan jihad spillover. The end of the Soviet-Afghan War in 1989 left the surplus of trained fighters with combat experience and guerrilla warfare skills. Weapons circulation increased in the region, making arms more accessible to emerging militant groups. So all those fighters were turned and redirected to Kashmir. Transnational jihadist ideology, developed during the Afghan conflict, began influencing sentiments of militancy in Kashmir. A pivotal development in the late 1980s was the formation of Hizbul Mujahideen, led by Sayyid Salahuddin and Muhammad Abdullah Khan. The organization quickly formed itself as a formidable force. Unlike JKLF's initial stance of making Jammu and Kashmir independent, they were very clear that they wanted to accede Jammu and Kashmir to Pakistan. Intelligence and logistical networks built during the Afghan war were redirected towards Kashmir. The success narrative of defeating a superpower in Afghanistan, that is the United States, created a psychological model that insurgency could succeed elsewhere. So this all kept building, and then comes the causes of the same. So Pakistan's sponsorship and proxy strategy. Following the first India-Pakistan war in 1947 and 48, the subsequent decades witnessed two major wars in 65 and 71, each reinforcing Pakistan's inability to secure its strategic objectives through conventional military engagement. And the humbling defeat of 1971 not only fundamentally reshaped the geography of the subcontinent, but also Pakistan's approach to conflict with India. Unable to match India's military might, it sought to low-cost, less overt, but equally disruptive war option, one that relied heavily on non-state actors, terrorist and Islamist militant groups. This new doctrine of Pakistan's asymmetric warfare became the cornerstone of Pakistan's proxy war. The 1990s saw a sharp rise in the involvement of foreign terrorists in Jammu and Kashmir, especially in the Kashmir Valley. The porous line of control and unregulated terrain were exploited by Pakistan to push heavily armed terrorists, often trained in Afghanistan and Pakistan-based camps. And since we live in a very digitalized world, media propaganda has a big role to play. The decades of 2010 to 2020 marked a paradigm shift in the terrorism in Jammu and Kashmir. Unlike the externally infiltrated fighters of the earlier decades, this new generation of terrorists were born, radicalized, and trained in Kashmir, leveraging digital platforms for propaganda and mobilization. This decade witnessed an increase in indoctrination of Kashmiri youth through online platforms, particularly social media. And we also recently witnessed this in Operation Sindhu, that there was so much misinformation, disinformation around what was happening on the ground level. And on the right, you can see this image. So this is from a Twitter page run by some radicalists. The message is very clear that they want to establish that Jammu and Kashmir is very different demographically, culturally from the rest of India, and which is why they should be independent. So such thoughts are circulated very easily, and a lot of people in Kashmir do subscribe to these ideas, do follow such accounts on social media. Pakistan's ISI, while maintaining its traditional terror infrastructure in POJK, increasingly focused on digital warfare, disseminating religious extremism and anti-India narratives and jihadi propaganda through proxies and information operations. Youth unemployment. Since the introduction of Article 370 and 35A insulated the Jammu and Kashmir from the rest of the country, heavily affecting the region's interaction and flow of investment. Due to the limited opportunities, the unemployment rates went up. Frustration among the educated but unemployed youth increased the vulnerability to recruitment. These terrorist organizations, they recruit very carefully. They look for people from destitute families who will get easily brainwashed and lure them into picking weapons against the state as well as people. Prolonged period of conflict in such areas also disrupt tourism, trade, and private investments in the region, as witnessed in the case of Jammu and Kashmir. Economic stagnation reinforced the cycles of dissatisfaction and instability. Political alienation. The perception of electoral manipulation, particularly after the 1987 elections, weakened public faith in democratic institutions. Gradual centralization and erosion of regional autonomy created the sense of political disempowerment. Limited space for dissent and opposition politics led some groups to view institutional channels as ineffective. A growing trust deficit between citizens and the state reinforced grievance-based narratives. Political marginalization enabled militant organizations to position themselves as alternative representatives of public sentiment. Ideological radicalization. This has the larger role to play. So over time, segments of the movement shifted from ethno-nationalist goals to religiously framed narratives. Transnational Islamist currents influenced local discourse and recruitment strategies. Martyrdom symbolism and resistant imagery emotionally mobilized the youth. There was an identity-based polarization between us versus them thinking. So even back in 2008, when Kasab was held and interview was taken, he clearly expressed that they were given wrong information about how they were indoctrinated, that in India, in Jammu and Kashmir, that people don't have the right to practice religion, they don't have the right to go to mosque, and there's so much brutality is happening to them, which was of course wrong. When he came to India, he witnessed that. So this was a very easy way of indoctrinating these uneducated people in the region as well as in Pakistan to use them against India. Ideological framing transformed political grievances into perceived moral and religious obligations. So the persistence of terrorism in Kashmir cannot be traced back to a single cause. External sponsorship through proxy strategy sustained conflict structurally, while political alienation deepened the local resentment. Youth unemployment created vulnerability to recruitment. Ideological radicalization provided moral justification for violence. And media propaganda amplified and normalized these narratives. So each of these pillars had a role to play in bringing terrorism in Kashmir and making it easy for it to sustain for such a long time. Together, these factors interact and reinforce one another, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of conflict that is political, social, and strategic in nature. On the basis of this, I would highly recommend this book, Operation Sindoor, which is by Lieutenant General KJS Dillon. It will really help you in understanding the genesis, causes, the history, and everything that India is doing in terms of countermeasures.